So I'm going to start with a little introduction. My name is Derek Karner. I'm the program manager at the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, which is in New York City. We have 3 programs: a studio program, a curatorial platform called the Project Space, and a community print shop. We're hosting Stephen Sewell today, who's going to talk about his film. He's a former SHIFT resident, which is a residency run by the Project Space for arts workers. And we are partnering with the Potato Farm Project, who have a space in the North Fork of Long Island, where we can send artists for a month or a few weeks to do some intensive work. So thank you very much to our hosts, and please welcome Stephen.
Thanks, Derek, for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for being here on a Saturday afternoon. Just before we get started, also, I'd really like to thank the Potato Farm Project, Drew Videhi, for letting me stay here, have this opportunity to indulge in kind of uninterrupted work, which is a pretty luxurious opportunity and one I've appreciated immensely. Also joining me today is Antonina Andi Pelletier, who's from the Maine Lobstermen's Association. So she'll be talking with me a little bit about the industry, some of the changes and things that are going on with it after we watch a little bit of what I've been working on. Just a little quick introduction for her. Andi is a New Yorker born, but was raised on the coast of Maine. She's currently the membership director of the Maine Lobstermen's Association, which was formed in 1954 and is an advocacy group for commercial lobstermen. And Andi has been there since 2015, so only 6 years in the 67 years of that organization's existence. And her passions beyond lobstering are public radio, books, and horses. So we'll get a chance to hear from her, some of the things that are going on. What I have to show you today is about a 17-minute excerpt. It is very much still a work in progress. So things like color and audio aren't totally formulated, but hopefully it gives an idea of some of the issues that the film is looking at in terms of it's kind of taking a very broad look at the industry and its history and some of the changes, which includes, cultural, political, and economic changes throughout history. One thing I should say, just as a little precautionary statement before I show it, the excerpt that I'm about to show does have sequences of flashing lights. There are also, it's a film about lobsters, and you don't get to enjoy lobsters without some lobsters dying. So there's also some scenes of dead lobsters or processing that is occurring. So just be forewarned that is occurring. And of course, also vulgarity for those of you who may have children attending. I also apologize because this is very much still a work in progress. I haven't had the opportunity to provide subtitles for anything. So some of the audio may not be discernible depending on either how familiar you are with the Maine accent or how good of a quality the audio was when it was recorded. But that being said, I'll share that. Like I said, it's about 17 minutes. After it's over, Andi and I will talk for a little bit, and then we'll both be happy to answer any questions you may have. So I'm going to mute myself and share this excerpt, and hopefully it plays okay. I know we're streaming over the internet, so I'm plugged into a router, and that should help.
Please feel free to use the chat to introduce yourselves or make comments or ask questions throughout, and we will get to those later.
fishing. It's you just do it. Well, pretty much the government did that for us. I used to go when I was really young. When I first started fishing, I was fishing on offshore boats. After high school, I got involved with gill netting. I think it was around 89 or 90. The government put us out of business. They didn't want any more nets in the water. So pretty much the only other thing to make a good living at was lobster. So that's how I got involved with that.
You know, everybody looking for a job, they only had to say a couple things. I have my own transportation, I'm reliable and a hard worker, and I don't do drugs, and that's it. And they could get any job they wanted. And it was weird to me coming from, you know, back home, like where you would need experience, you would need resources, you would need all kinds of things just to get a job. But up here, that's it.
Every young boy on the island, it seemed like, wanted to go lobster. That's all they wanted to do. They didn't want to go to college. They wanted to get a new boat and get out there and start making money. And, you know, they were telling their teachers, well, I make more money than you do, you know. But they said, what do you make a year? And they said, oh, 50 or 60,000. They said, well, I make that in the summertime, lobstering.
Most of your older fishermen like me have seen bad fishing. You know, I can remember when we used to haul for, you know, weeks on end and never get a pound of trap.
Back in the late 70s, early 80s, if you got a pound to a trap, that was good fishing. Then it kept escalating, up. Pretty soon they were getting 5 pounds, 6 pounds, 7 pounds to a trap, no matter where you put the trap.
I think that the waters have warmed enough that a lot of the lobsters just stopped coming in as close to shore. I think that they started molting their shells kind of deeper out in deeper waters. So you see a lot of fishermen now fishing offshore that never did before. I mean, there's a lot more offshore boats than there ever was back then.
The fishery has changed in the last 10 years drastically. It's gone from people of, you know, modest boats and not much debt in the fishery to the whole younger generation in huge debt and offshore in big boats with expensive, heavy gear doing a totally different fishery.
It's a lot more expensive to go lobstering now than it was, 20 years ago or so. The price of lobsters has not really changed that much, but the price of doing business has gone up a lot.
You can't go fishing without bait, and bait is nearly triple, maybe quadruple the cost of when I started at the age of 10. We paid $5 for a bucket of herring, and now it's up to like 22 if you get the cheap garbage.
But it's interesting, I guess, because I think a lot of the things I'm seeing compared to a lot of the things I'm being told don't totally line up. I've been told pretty much my whole life that, like, what are you going to do next year? Because there's going to be no lobsters. Like, there's no lobsters if there's going to be no lobsters. But I'm catching, 100 times more than my dad was when he was my age.
But what's funny is they reduced the amount of gear. The same amount of lobsters got caught.
This is only my second year fishing. I grew up in like rural Pennsylvania where I never went to the beach. I didn't even know lobstering was a thing, really.
Most boats is one captain, one stern man, and the captain runs the boat, keeps track of where the gear is at, what needs bait and when, and usually he gaffs the buoys and runs it up through the hauler, and you do everything else. Opening the trap, picking the lobsters, measuring, bait the trap, empty it out, clean it, swing it, get it ready to set it out, set everything out, and then you do it again. And that's all you do all day long, over and over and over and over again.
The best I can describe it is the fishing industry is hooray for me and fuck you. You know, you're out to catch lobsters, you're out to make money. It's everyone else's competition pretty much.
Fishing in general, I guess, is just a really paranoid kind of thing.
You don't ask somebody what they caught for the day. You don't ask where they caught them.
To go and ask a lobster fisherman how much they made or how many pounds they landed is kind of rude. I guess you wouldn't go to a banker and say, oh, what's your salary and how much do you make per hour?
My dad has a sticker on the back of his truck that says, I'm a fisherman, therefore I lie.
It's kind of known who does well and who doesn't. I mean, you obviously see the guy with the new boat, the new trucks, and, you know, the camps.
Most people are kind of conservative and they don't say too much, because usually if you start telling how good you did or where you did good, next thing you know, you've got traps all around you.
You can get a legal fishing license to fish wherever you want in the state, but you'll often run into the fishermen there who are very territorial.
People know where they're supposed to fish and where they're not supposed to fish. And when they stray too far, they got a reminder.
I mean, it wasn't easy. When I started, I lost traps.
I mean, they gave me all the normal shit that they would give any young fisherman.
But I started fishing where I fished, so people knew me. I had made a name before I had started fishing.
You know, you want to be friends with everyone, because if you have a boat problem, who's out there to help you? It's just you and whoever else is fishing.
If one of those guys' boat was on fire or sinking,
you know, everyone's going to be headed for them as fast as they can and save their ass, and that's it.
Once you establish yourself a little more, then people recognize that you're here to stay, and then you make good relationships. I mean, obviously no one is that fond of the new guy, but then there's plenty of people too that recognize the fact that there's not many people in my generation that are going.
Okay, so that's the 17 minutes that I had and was able to export for today. Before Antonina and I get into talking about it, I just really quickly would like to just say thank you very much to a number of people who've been involved. There's still a lot of work to do and continue to do, but just real quick, I'd like to thank David Cousins, Emily Cunningham, Michael Donahue, Jeff Eaton, Dan Gagne, Charles Goki, Colby Hardy, Rebecca Hodgson, Michael Myers, Andrew Palakia, Mike and Philbrook, Sadie Samuels, Krista Tripp, Richard Wally, and Leroy Weed Sr. These are all lobstermen and industry people that I spoke with and was able to interview for this. And also would really like to thank Steph Lindsay and Greenhead Lobster for just giving me access to the spaces to film some of the stuff that you saw. As well as Jim Comboy and Jane McNichol, who have a place in Maine that I've had the opportunity to stay at a number of times and was really something of a starting point for this whole project. That being said, Antonina, I'd love to hear your thoughts and responses. I know this is the first time you're seeing any of this footage. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, forgot I was muted. Thank you for inviting us along and for bringing the lobster fishery and its realities, I guess, forward. So the Maine Lobstermen's Association, just so you're clear about what my position is we're an organization, an advocacy organization that we work to keep the lobster resource viable, as well to advocate for fishermen and for their communities. And I think that one of the things that isn't always apparent is the concept of community. And I know that sort of in the last pieces of the 17 minutes that we were watching was sort of talking about the competitive nature of fishing, which belies the actual community that's involved. The fishing community is a staunch, stalwart, close-knit group. And they will be there to rescue whatever boat or to whatever person, or if people are ill, they will haul traps for one another. It's a very it's an amazing community. And I just want to be sure that that is, I don't know if Stephen's getting to that piece in the story, but that is definitely a big piece of who Maine fishermen are. I really appreciate too, and if you all had questions on sort of the first part of with the guys on the boats and they're pulling the gear out, one of the big things that you were watching is sustainability in action. The fact that they measure those lobsters means that they're checking for size, because size matters, people. A lobster that is too small, it hasn't reached breeding stock size yet, and so it's put back overboard. That's why they're throwing those lobsters back over the sides. And actually, a lot of times they're throwing more lobsters off than they are actually keeping. The second thing they're looking for is how big that lobster is. Excuse me. A lobster that's past a certain size, they know it's reliable brood stock and they want to keep that. So male or females, they keep. One of the things that wasn't shown is the concept of V-notching, which is a female lobster who is egged out, meaning she's produced eggs. They know she's a breeder. That female's put back over the side. And the idea is that they are keeping the lobster stock strong and viable, because we want to keep this fishery going because it is a generational thing. I know there was that quote at the end about that there are fewer kids coming on, but in some of these island communities and coastal communities, we're talking generations of fishermen, kids learning from their grandfathers, learning from their fathers, their uncles. It's there and it's strong. I also thought it was kind of interesting to note too, just because we've been thinking about this lately, but everything that you were looking at on those boats, a lot of times those boats are made here in Maine. They're built in shops up and down the Maine coast. That rope that you're seeing hauled over the side with various widths and everything else, that also is made by Maine or sold by Maine vendors. The traps are made here in Maine. Those tools that they're using to measure are made here in Maine. A lot of what you're seeing, that bait is often caught off the coast of Maine. Everything tends to be very localized in the fishery, which means that the economic impact of the lobster fishery is more than just the catch of the lobster. And I love that profit and loss piece, because that's very true. There are days of bad fishing and you're not making any money. But it's important to understand that the impact of it's not just about the actual act of fishing, it's the act of all of the pieces that go along, those bait barrels, those bait bags, the spikes. I mean, all of that stuff that is part of that fishery and part of the economic structure of Maine, which is a pretty unique thing. It's, I don't think you find too many places in the US where so much of the economic infrastructure is built into a localized area.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Andy. Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff that you're saying that isn't in the 70 minutes that we watched, but definitely will come into play later on, especially the conservation, the V-notching, the vent sizes on traps, things like that. Because that's one of the things I was really interested in when I started doing this and talking with people, is the extent to which everyone is in direct competition with each other, but also is completely dependent on establishing trust with each other to make sure that the industry is operated a certain way, that everyone is playing by the same rules, and that everyone's making sure that they still have this industry around, whether it's for subsequent generations or for themselves. So there's this kind of very interesting tension that underlies all of that trust. So yeah, looking forward to being able to get in that. And then also you caught kind of glimpses of it at the very beginning. But one of the other things that will come in too is looking at like the DMR reports for landings and the average prices of things, from a pound of herring to a gallon of gas to a pound of lobster, and how that's adjusted and how that's constantly on the mind of fishermen. And I'm glad you enjoyed the P&L point. I was kind of looking for a way to just represent what's actually going through someone's mind while they're out there. And it's easy to kind of take images from the ocean that just look really incredible and are engrossing. Even when they're pictures of bait, there's something kind of very interesting visually about that. But then I wanted to kind of overlay this calculation that's constantly going through their mind of like, okay, where am I? Am I on track today to turn a profit, or am I going to operate at a loss and then going to have to try and hope that something changes with the price of bait or the price of lobster that can help get me out of this hole?
Yep, that's a very good point. And I think it was interesting. I think, was that Sadie Samuels that was commenting on the buckets of bait and how much they cost when she was 8 years old or 10 years old?
That was Rebecca.
That was Rebecca Hodgson.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, then that's changed a lot. I mean, the price of herring has actually changed substantially over the past 3 years. So even though the boat price might be coming up, it actually doesn't necessarily make a difference at the end of the year when you're looking at those expenses and that profit margin. And it is a fluctuating fishery. I know I heard Dave Cousins talking about how the kids these days don't know what a bad fishery is. And we've been lucky. We've been very lucky to have a good run. But for those that have been fishing a long time, that it wasn't always the case. You have good years and you have bad years, and you have to make sure that you're setting money aside to reserve to make sure that you can make it through that bad year.
And kind of on that, I know one of the things that David talks about that will get mentioned later are some of the advocacy things that the MLA has done to help ensure that. I mean, part of it has, as David says, part of it is he's looking at ocean temperatures that have made the Gulf of Maine something of a sweet spot for lobster breeding, which has really ballooned their numbers. But there's also the way that the MLA has advocated for things like minimum sizes, which go not just for Maine, but multiple states and countries, actually. And then also dredging, which was something I know the MLA was involved in. But I'd love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, so the size management, I think, is big. And that actually came from Lobstermen long before us. So the MLA was formed in 1954, though, to sort of give a voice to lobstermen. As you can see, many of them are very independent because it's a single operator. These are not corporations. You don't have somebody owning multiple boats and hiring a whole bunch of crew to come in. This is a single operator. So their business it's small. So you have something like 4,900 individual proprietors on the coast of Maine, small businesses. Anyway, but getting them together, and there's a joke saying that if you bring 8 lobstermen in a room and ask them their opinion, you're going to get 9 opinions. So, be careful what you ask for. But so to bring them all together and bring them to at least come up with some shared viewpoints on lobster management was a big accomplishment for the MLA in 1954. And we've managed to be in existence and very strong ever since. We are the oldest and biggest fishing organization in New England. So it's pretty cool. And we do advocate for all kinds of issues over the years. And of course, with my somewhat limited experience, there have been less to speak of. Dave Cousins, who was represented here in the film, we heard his voice talking. He was president for the MLA for 27 years and was definitely part of some of the bigger things that made a big difference into how you fish. And that's policy and legislation that happens not only at the local and the state level, but also at the federal level. And then the second part of your question, again, Stephen, was we were asking about dredging. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, specifically getting the maximum size laws to apply to places other than Maine, and then also how dredging was impacting the fishery and the things that MLA did to address that and why.
So I would definitely say that the MLA has worked not just with dredging, but things like, you all heard of brown-tailed moth? It's a caterpillar that comes in and it sets itself up in trees, and it has little hairs on it. They can separate, and they're incredibly irritating to people, and people get like hives and rashes, and it's a problem. So towns and communities start spraying for brown-tailed moth. The problem is that pesticide that they're using, if it's sprayed too close to the ocean, it washes into the water and it kills lobster larvae. And we think about lobsters as being these ugly, sort of larger creatures, right? But they start out, as eggs. They start out as larvae that are really almost microscopic. They're incredibly beautiful, and they float on the surface of the water. So if you have pesticides rolling into that water, you're killing off all that lobster larva and affecting your future brood stock. So the MLA has always been a part of that. Same thing goes with the concept of dredging: where you're dredging, how you're dredging, where is that stuff being put, how is it being stored, what's being stirred up when you do that dredging. Are we dredging near a mill that could potentially have hazardous waste and toxic elements, metals that are being uprooted and are also going to affect the ecosystem that is there? So the MLA has been a part of that all along, but that's also because the lobstermen care. This is where they fish. This is their livelihood, and it's more than just a job. It's their life. And so they want to keep fishing. They want that fishing to be there for their kids. So they're going to fight to make sure that what they're fishing in is is clean and to the healthiest that it can be. And I think that that's one of the things people don't always recognize, because you're looking at a lobster boat, it runs on diesel fuel, it's a little smelly, bait's a little smelly, but at the same time, they were environmentalists really before that phrase was even coined. You know, they're out there to preserve the water, preserve the ocean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been a recurring theme with the people that I've interviewed as well, who kind of view the ocean as just an extension of their home or backyard and treat it as such, and kind of maintain it as a shared space, but one that, you know, needs to be sustained. But yeah, I realized the dredging is fascinating. I blanked on that. I was also thinking the dragging that was happening for
the lobster
offshore.
dragging. Yes, sorry. Yeah. So in other states, including Massachusetts, you have draggers. And if you are not familiar with commercial fishing, oftentimes they're dropping big nets with weights on them, and they're scraping the bottom of the ocean floor and bringing up basically whatever's there. And they're trying to catch a school of fish and bring it all in. That is all then hauled up on deck and processed there. And the stuff that they don't want is either tossed overboard, or it's called bycatch. So in other states, if you land lobster on your boat, you can bring that in, you can sell that lobster. But lobstermen, obviously, especially in Maine, do not believe in the concept of dragging because it destroys ocean bottom. Lobsters live in crevasses and rocks, and they like rocky bottom. They don't, you know, they want to keep that environment preserved. So we're against dragging and fought very hard to make sure that wasn't happening, and that you could not legally land a dragger caught lobster in Maine and make a profit on it in order to discourage that type of fishing.
So another thing that's kind of happened through a combination of all these conservation efforts, you know, temperature getting to a kind of optimal point, and other fishery management things is, you know, and one thing that doesn't really get talked about as much is the fact that a lot of these lobstermen, they're catching way more lobster than could ever be consumed in the United States. And so there's now massive international markets for lobsters. You know, you said as much yourself, as much as they're throwing over, even just a fraction of what they're actually keeping ends up being sold here in the domestic market. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the changes that kind of brought that about and how that has been handled, and they've kind of found places to start selling this massive amount of lobsters that's shown up in the last 10 to 15 years.
So I'll preface by saying that the Maine Lobstermen's Association, because we represent lobstermen, lobstermen land their catch at the dock. That is literally where their contribution to supply chain ends. As far as bringing that product in. So they are not involved with marketing. They are not involved with selling that lobster. You now have lobster dealers who buy either from the dock. There's a lot of co-ops, which are lobstermen owned. These are small organizations that they bring all their product together. All that lobster that's caught over a day is then sold as a group to buyers, to processors. And I know you mentioned Greenhead Lobster, which is one of the processors here in Maine. And they also have they have a national presence for sure. And I think they do international. I'm not even sure. We're just not that familiar with the sale of lobster. The Maine Lobster Dealers Association is the primary organization that deals with those larger groups and the buyers that are out there and creating those markets, both nationally and internationally. But there's a lot of Maine ingenuity that happens too. Greenhead Lobster cracked me up. They were going to Aspen and they would put up a food truck in Aspen and they would sell lobster rolls. So you could come down the slopes and then you could get a lobster roll from Maine. Like, how great was that? But yes, you've seen a lot of the Asian markets expand. They love seafood over there. The European market has remained very strong. We are in competition with Canada, which is a whole I'm not sure I could speak to it all, but it has to do a lot with tariffs and the overseas markets. But it has been a boon to the industry for sure to know that all the lobster that we catch is sold. And that's pretty impressive, particularly last year with the pandemic. We thought in 2020 things were going to be really hard. We were wondering if we were even going to be fishing. Guys didn't set out until really late in the season because they weren't sure that they were going to have a market for their product. But due to some local marketing, both from these places like Greenhead Lobster, like Luke's Lobster, like Ready Seafood, as well as the co-ops, as well as just local sourcing your seafood, they were able to move all of their lobster that was caught in 2020, and that's continued to be strong in 2021.
Yeah, and that's been an interesting thing doing research, talking to people, is there is this kind of separation between the supply side and the distribution side. And one of the questions I've asked everyone throughout this process is just, how does the price of lobster get set, or do you have any idea how the price gets set? And it's exactly like you said, it's the 8 lobstermen, nine different answers. And it's interesting because you're right. In like the old days, it was you brought the lobsters to the dock, you got paid, and then that was it. Don't think about it anymore. Just go out the next day and fish and repeat and just kind of continue. And as long as everything is okay, you can continue doing that. But things like COVID that suddenly completely upended the distribution side of things, especially one of the lobstermen I talked to said, with all of the cruise ships completely, docked up, canceled, that's a massive market for lobster tails, all those things. And so he was like, it didn't matter that we could catch all these lobster because, the weather was fine. And if you're on a lobster boat, it's a safe environment. It's not really as much of a COVID hazard as working in an enclosed office space. It's like, but it didn't really matter. So the price had really, really dropped. And then also, dealing with international tariffs, this has been a thing that suddenly people are becoming more and more aware of the impact that it has on them. It's no longer just put it on the dock, sell it, go about your day. Now, I'm in my experience talking to people, they're becoming a little more aware of just how much these broader trade agreements actually impact their livelihood and start to affect things from the price of gasoline to the price of the steel that's used to make the traps.
Yeah, and the MLA to that piece is also one of the things we were doing prior to the pandemic was bringing lobstermen every year to the Boston Seafood Show, which is an international seafood show, and it's often mind-blowing for them because they've never seen so much seafood for sale in their life, and they finally understand, here in Maine, lobster sells itself, but as soon as you step outside of our borders and you're competing with other types of products and products that are sort of prefabricated to make it really easy and very accessible, that becomes a very different story of how you're selling something. And there are some great companies that have done a lot to make seafood accessible, make lobster accessible in your local grocery store. Luke's Lobster is one of them for sure, by making lobster that you can get in the frozen food section at Whole Foods. So.
Well, should we, I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat or anything, but were there questions from people? Should we take a look at those?
Yeah, there's a couple good questions in the chat. Do you want me to read them out?
Yeah.
Okay, so from Greg Lindquist, excuse me. What keeps corporations from coming in and squashing the individual proprietor fisher people? Local laws, lobster mafia, etc.?
Not the lobster mafia. I know that would be super cool, but no. It actually is state law that it is sole proprietor. You cannot own multiple boats. So
yeah, and it's even more so than that. It's the license is also restricted to a single vessel. So one of the lobstermen that I interviewed, she had just started. And when you start, depending on how you get it, there's a couple of different ways to get into it. A lot of younger people, what they'll do is the apprenticeship program, which you have to work a number of hours on a commercial fishing vessel, lobster fishing vessel. And then once you become eligible to get your captain's license, you can do that. And then but you aren't allowed to fish the full number of traps. You start at, I think, 200. And then every year you get to add another 100 traps. So this young woman that I interviewed, she did that and then had been helping her dad on his boat. So what happened is they were splitting traps on the boat. So even though they both had their own licenses, the boat can only fish a total of 800 traps. So he was fishing 600, she was fishing 200, and he was just kind of letting her do that. But around the time that she got to 400 traps, her father was like, look, you're really starting to cut into my profit here. It's like, it's time. We need to find you a boat. You need to buy it. And you're going to have to set out and do this on your own. So it's very strictly single owner operator. And it's exactly for those reasons, to keep corporations from coming in, buying a fleet of boats, buying a bunch of licenses, and then putting up job postings. And part of it is also because the job really doesn't allow that. You can't have a corporation come in and say, all right, you're fishing Monday through Thursday, 4 a.m. to 4 p.m., because it's entirely dependent on what the weather is, whether or not you can even, if it's safe to even go out. And also maybe it's going to take, maybe you're not going to work 8 hours. Maybe you're going to work 12 hours because you're getting a bunch of traps that are tangled up with other people's traps, or it's just taking you longer to navigate in heavy fog. So it really just doesn't fit that kind of industry model. So, and that's been a thing that's really also invested a certain individual hard work mentality within the organization for decades, because it is single lobstermen with maybe 1 or 2 sternmen going out and catching lobsters.
Great. There's another question about Stephen, how you work with personal narratives, documentary information, and merge it with experimental filmmaking. What are the things you take into consideration in this process?
Thank you for that question. I really like working with interviews and audio. One of the things I was really excited about with this project was because of COVID, I did all of the interviews on Zoom, which turned out to be a kind of great thing because it allowed me to interview so many people in a short period of time. And it's also allowed me to get, I think, better responses during the interviews. It's a very different thing to interview someone on Zoom or on the phone when you're just recording it with their permission, versus showing up, putting a camera in someone's face, setting up lights, clipping a mic onto them, and then asking questions that way. So it really seemed like I was able to get really nice results that way, and then just interview a lot more people in a short period of time. But also because of this, I don't have visuals, so there's no embodied voice in this film, which was another thing I really liked, because I didn't want to make a film that's about the experience of a single lobsterman or a single crew. I wanted to make a film that's about the experience of a bunch of people that might have divergent opinions and views. And so that way the visuals could just be something that exists to show you information that maybe you're not seeing, or show you information that's either complementing or maybe even contradicting what's being said. And then the audio is really driving what you're getting. So that's kind of how I approach that. And then you can kind of start clustering interviews together around ideas, which is something that will happen more with the film. And then I also liked this idea of using the lobster as a narrator. Right now it's just subtitled, but I might play around with having someone voice the lobster as the narrator. And it was something, I can't remember, Andy, if I said this to you or if I was talking with Monique the other day, and I mentioned it's really interesting to me that it's it's seemingly easier for people not in the industry to empathize with a lobster than it is for them to empathize with a lobsterman. So I liked the idea of starting out with this like very Netflixy cooking show introduction, but then having the lobster actually be like, no, this is a good thing. Like I'm reaching the apex of my purpose, and then use that as a way of looking into how a lobster moves through these various stages of being caught, being sold, being distributed, and getting increasing in value along the way.
Antonia, people are curious about you and how you got involved in the lobster industry. If you don't mind sharing a bit of your background.
So Maine is, along the coast of Maine, lobstering is very much just a piece of it, whether you're in a fishing community or not. So I grew up with a lobsterman family right across the street, was familiar with it that way. But I mean, we have in downtown Portland, which is our largest city, we have a lobsterman that is sort of one of the center statues in our town. So fishing has always been a part of it. It was an opportunity that came across actually through a different channel. I was applying for a job on something else, health insurance, to be honest, and then ended up with my experience with membership, doing their membership program, which has been an humbling and wonderful opportunity. I'm very grateful to have this job.
There's a question about Seaspiracy. It was a very eye-opening documentary that enlightened him on multiple issues from balance in the food chain, dragging, large corporation involvement, to certifying organizations not being vigilant or rather not doing their jobs. But as a documentary was invested, it was an interesting flow of story, starting with the dolphins, going to the next issue, in the end, touching on a lot of different things, issues. Artistically speaking, what do you think of that kind of storytelling, and has that influenced your body of work?
I haven't seen Seaspiracy. I've heard some comments about it. I think, I mean, having not seen it, I can't really speak to it, but based on the comment, I'm always a little suspect of stories that very seamlessly kind of construct narratives and go from kind of one topic into the next very, very evenly, since that never really seems to be my experience when I'm doing research for something. Like, for example, while I've been doing research for this film, it seemed like every other week something new is showing up that I was like, oh, well, now I need to look into this, and now I need to look into this, and now I need to look into this. And the difficulty is, trying to get all of it to make sense, which I tend to shy away from. I would rather, and this gets to also why I like working with audio and work with them the way I do. I like to kind of cluster them as fragments that aren't necessarily going to be a complete continuation of thought, but are going to start introducing other things. And that's also why at the very beginning you get that really like rapid compression of everything. There's actually, it's like 9 hours of footage that you see in about 17 seconds, going from people leaving a processing plant at the end of the day all the way to 4 a.m. when I'm standing on the pier in Stonington. And kind of everything that influences what's going on in between there can just kind of be jumped at all around. But also there's largely a lot of disconnect, and Andy can talk about this a little bit more. I mean, one of the things that happened in the 90s is there was this like radically divergent opinion of thought from scientists and lobstermen as to what was going on with lobster populations. Scientists were absolutely convinced that the fishery was on the verge of collapse, and they were calling for very strict regulations and de-escalation of the scale of the fishery and other things. And meanwhile, fishermen were saying, look, as Andy's been saying, we've been V-notching the tails of female lobsters with eggs and throwing them back. We've been throwing oversized males back. Like, you're not out on the boats with us. You're not seeing the amount of lobsters that we're putting back into the ocean versus what we are keeping. And so there was this really, for a long time, this just absolute wedge between these two opinions, and that seemed almost irreconcilable. But eventually it was basically proven that the lobstermen were right, because the catch landings each year just stayed consistent, and in fact stayed consistently going up. And so this pending collapse of the industry just never happened. And this is something that's happened throughout the industry's history. There have been times where scientists and fisheries surveys experts have been in sync with fishermen and what they're seeing, and then times where they've been out of sync, and vice versa.
So when I titled you there, I put Maine Lobster Association, and then I heard you say later it's all the Lobstermen. So how is that working out? Because I heard so many women on the excerpt. Is there a controversy with that, or are you just?
There's not. And if you come to Maine and refer to a woman who fishes as a lobster woman, she will correct you. She's a lobsterman. It's actually, believe it or not, despite the fact that there's a predominance of men, there's actually not a lot of gender inequality. There's not, if you can do the work, you can show up and haul those traps and, bring your gear in and all the rest of it, then it's really about your ability than it is about your gender, which is refreshing.
Cool.
Just touching, if I may, lightly on the Seaspiracy thing, just because I also did not watch it, but the reason I didn't watch it was because of the tone. Many fishermen, I believe, did not watch it because it seemed to be out there to drive an agenda about horror and shock and unsustainable and we're all gonna die. And it just not sure that film actually represented fishing in a credible way. And, the concept of sustainability was not really, I think, well addressed. I think people were misportrayed in that film. So we're always a little leery when we see films like that out there. And I appreciate Stephen's efforts to really portray the fishery for what it is and not drive an agenda about whether it's good or bad or the damage that it's done. I mean, nothing's perfect in this world, but I think that Lobstermen can definitely be credited with constantly trying to improve what they're doing. And by all, the highest piece being the sustainability. We want those stocks to continue. We don't want to be putting trash in our ocean. We don't want to be putting pollutants in our ocean. We want to find, cleaner ways to run our boats. We want to, there's a lot of work that takes place that's, and you just talked about it, Stephen, but the bond between scientists and fishermen here in Maine has gotten a lot stronger since the 90s. They work together a little bit better, not always in agreement, but they work a lot better because they're both going towards a common goal of sustainability and keeping the fishery viable.
Yeah, and actually on that, I mean, that was something I kind of learned very quickly when I started this project, was how to represent myself to Lobstermen in order to get them to agree to even talk to me. There's a lot of skepticism towards media, towards anyone with a camera who's showing up going, hey, will you talk about this? And so, yeah, I really kind of had to figure out, like, how can I get these people to understand that I'm not here to tell them that they're polluting the ocean or destroying these environments or a destructive force, and kind of convince them that, like, I'm just very interested in understanding how it operates, how that operation has changed historically, according to what forces, and how that's impacted their outlook or their livelihood or the way that they conduct business or deal with people. So I've been incredibly grateful for the people who have offered their stories and experiences to me.
So Stephen, how did you get involved with lobsters? How were you interested in it?
Thanks, Mom and Dad. Well, so actually the reason that this all began is because my mom's side of the family invented a holiday called Lobster Day, which happens every leap year, which the origin story of that is that when my mother was younger, her father brought lobster back for dinner one night, which was like a very special treat, and they had it, and her siblings all loved it. And she supposedly went up to my grandfather and was, asking him, when's the next time we can have lobster? And he didn't want to break his little daughter's heart and tell her, well, we don't live on the East Coast, so we can't really afford to have lobster all the time. So he thought he would just be clever and say, well, next leap year. It turned out that year was a leap year, and my mother, being a child with their sponge-like brains and steel trap memories, remembered. And so he had to do this, and so it became a tradition that her side of the family did. And so every leap year we would go eat lobster at my grandmother's house. So that was my introduction to lobster at a young age.
Well, great. This has been very enlightening, and I love hearing all these stories. And in your excerpt, and the voices talking about their experience was really interesting to me. So thank you very much. Is there a final question from anyone? So, well then.
I see Richard Nelson has his hand up.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm a You can hear me, all right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm a retired lobsterman for over 35 years I fished. And there's a couple of things I really appreciate his intellectual understanding of what's going on in all these aspects of the fishery. I think that's great. I'm a little bit bothered by the film clip, and it seemed kind of very much disjointed to me. And when you throw those sort of audio clips of different pieces of different people talking about different things, their tendency to be easy to capture a lot of little negative tidbits and things that go along. And when I think of lobstering, I'm here in Friendship, Maine. There's all this generations, 4 and 5 generations of people out there fishing, that there's this underlying thing, which is harder to capture on film, but it should be the a goal of the filmmaker, of this underlying thing of, yes, we have a great underlying love of the ocean. We have a great appreciation of being able to work outdoors. We have this appreciation of the generational aspects of it. And that's really hard for people to explain that, because people who work normal jobs in cities and things don't understand that. You often hear as a lobster, oh, they'll be able to get other jobs if that falls through. But to talk to somebody whose father and grandfather and great grandfather, everybody in their household did one work, it's unimaginable doing another job for them. And not only is it sort of unimaginable for them to take on another profession, but there is no other profession here in some of these towns, you know. I often have said, I've made a lot of comments on various governmental things, that I come from a town of 1,100 people, and out of that, 300 of them have commercial fishing license. And besides that, there's 2 boat shops and 1 trap manufacturer. So it's an amazing amount of people all under one economic sort of umbrella here. So that's the kind of thing I'd like to see expressed in any kind of film, that sort of underlying qualities that are hard to perceive and hard to change you don't just stop and take a different direction on. But he's got a good start and a good concept of what's going on. So that's good.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. And you're absolutely right. And I do actually have interviews of exactly that. People talking about, my grandfather and his father's father, and exactly, this idea of the ocean being a haven and a place that can always provide for you and your families. Going as early back as one of the people I interviewed was 79 years old when I interviewed him. He talks about growing up in the 50s and that being a source of sustainability for the family. So yeah, that will be making its way into the final film. And I'm glad to hear that you're enjoying where it is so far and can see what it needs still.
Yeah, I know Stephen and I had talked a bit about, and obviously we're out of time. I know it's after 2:00 at this point, but we had talked about the concept of this changing communities and the effect on some of these coastal areas when you have a fishing community that's been in place for such a long time, and what it looks like with the cost of land changing or the diminishment of, we did lose ground fishing in the 80s. So people that were fishing other types, they either did go on to do other jobs, or they became lobstermen. And it does depend on where in Maine you are. Fishermen in southern Maine have a very different lifestyle and a very different access to resources than people do even where Richard is in Friendship, which is in mid-coast Maine. And the further you get up the coast, the closer to Canada, the less and less there is. And there are communities that are based exclusively on lobster fishing. That's it. There's nothing else.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone. I think we'll end it there. Is there any links that you'd like to share, Stephen, for more information? And Antonina?
I don't at the moment know. Once the film is completed, then yeah, there will be announcements about where that will be shown. But I'm sure Andi has some resources that she can share.
Yep, so mainelobstermen.org is our website, and that is information about us. We also have an Instagram page and Facebook. If you're interested about lobstering or just want to know more about it, there's definitely a lot of links on our page. I'm sure that once Stephen's product is finished, we'll be having some links to that as well on our calendar and social media. But it's been a pleasure to be here. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you so much,
everyone.
And hi, Richard. Bye, Richard. It's good to see you.